I think it takes very little to be polite and to give people their basic dignity. Then surely there's no reason to keep me for 30 minutes asking me ridiculous questions, ignoring me for long periods, and just being an ass.
I've always used this quote because it is quite relevant in Africa, that until the lion knows how to write, the story of the jackal will favor the hunter. This is the case of Africa, because Africa's story has always been told by people who are not African. Much of our history is always written in books that were published outside the continent. Our history is largely known by whites. And when someone has the hold of your history, he has a high propensity of telling a lie. So this is why many African people are waking up and starting to tell the African story. In today's video, we are going to look at one bright African lady, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She is a Nigerian author known for telling the story of Africa, and she has always been invited in different world stages to speak about her literary work and the story of Africa as she can only tell. In this video, she is being interviewed by a French journalist who kind of has some misconceptions about Africa, and I like how she responds to these hard questions. Let's watch this, then come back and share our thoughts together.
African literature, does it have meaning for you?
Comme ça pour faire des guillemets.
African writing, yes, and I think of myself as coming from a tradition of African writing. I think I'm here today because of the people who came before me. I'm here today because Chinua Achebe wrote, and Flora Mwapa wrote, and Ame Ataidu wrote, and Muthoni Lekimani wrote, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote. I think of myself as coming from a tradition. But I also, the reason that I sometimes worry about labels like that is that, for me, it's not so much the labels as it is the value that we give to them. So sometimes when something is labeled African literature, I start to worry because I think what is important for me, it's imperative that we give African literature the same value that we give literature from any other part of the world. That we don't see it as, sometimes I think that, so there have been times when I've been asked, are you an African writer? And I, especially when I'm in a bad mood, I say no. And the reason, when I haven't slept well, the reason I say no is that I sometimes think that that label, it's not because I'm ashamed or because if I were to be born again, I want to be born an African. I'm deeply happy to come from this wonderful place. But I think in literary circles, there is often the tendency to read African literature and African writers not so much as literature as anthropology. That we're supposed to kind of explain something native and deep and primitive. And many people in Africa just, they're women who just want to get the best hair cream, right? But somehow, everything is supposed to have a kind of great noble weight about the suffering of the people. And so when I push back at labels like that, it's because of that. It's not that I realize, of course, that there's a wonderful tradition of African writing, and I'm very proud because I'm from that tradition. But I'm not sure that I would be very enthusiastic about that label becoming overly mainstream. I think African writers write books, they write literature.
And Chimamanda, you have two countries, two homes, two cultures, at least. And you also have several languages in your novels. Your novels, you write in English, the official language in Nigeria. But there are also the languages spoken in Nigeria, Igbo, Yoruba, I hope I'm pronouncing this properly. And is it that wealth you grew up in which makes you want to write with everything you have inside yourself?
I don't know. I speak only 2 languages, sadly. I wish I spoke more, but and and I grew up in Igbo land. So I grew up surrounded by Igbo speakers, and I grew up surrounded by Igbo culture. And I grew up in a university community, so it was very progressive and very English speaking. But it was also rooted in Igbo cultural norms. And I think those have shaped me. I think that there is a sense in which my sensibility is Nigerian, particularly, but it's also Igbo. There's certain things that are particularly Igbo, and it's having been raised in southeastern Nigeria, where Igbo culture was kind of the norm. You went to the market and people just spoke Igbo to you automatically. And you absorb these ideas, things like respect for elders. And of course, there's a lot I quarrel with. There's a lot about Igbo culture that I want to change, that I want to push back on. And they're mostly things that I think are oppressive to women. But in a large sense, I think my Igbo sensibility has shaped my storytelling. And even the use of language. I write in English because I was educated in English, and I can't really write. I mean, I can write Igbo, but I can't make an argument in Igbo because I don't have the skills. But there is a sensibility from having been raised in an Igbo culture that I think shapes the way I tell my stories.
And do people read your books in Nigeria?
They do, shockingly. They do.
Est-ce qu'il y a des librairies?
Are there bookshops in Nigeria?
Je vois, mais c'est précisément parce que ça vous fait...
Yes, it's about it differently, and that is why I'm saying, are there bookshops? Of course, I imagine there are. But I could ask the question to the French. Do people read in France? I think less and less so.
You know, I think it reflects very poorly on French people that you have to ask me that question. I really do. Because, I mean, because I think surely, I mean, it's 2000, you know, I mean, come on. My books are read in Nigeria. They're studied in schools, actually not just Nigeria, across the continent of Africa. And it means a lot to me because obviously I'm very grateful to be read everywhere in the world, but there's something about being read by the people about whom you write. And some of my writing, there are people who have sort of made stage plays of some of the stories in Nigeria. When I wrote Half of a Yellow Sun, I remember doing my first event in Lagos, and it was a full house, and it suddenly turned into people just arguing about history. And I sat back and I just enjoyed it. So people were throwing words at each other. And for me, what was wonderful was that literature had made this happen, that because of this contested part of our history, people had read this book, and suddenly they were talking about it and they were disagreeing. But the point is that we're having a conversation, and that conversation had been prompted by literature. And so I felt hopeful about it.
Donc on prend la dernière question qui venait.
So the very last question, you saw there was a man's hand going up. Yes, indeed, it is a man.
Thank you very much. First, really thank you for the wonderful time I had listening to you tonight. It was really nice, thank you. And I wanted just to ask you, we are in the French diplomacy headquarters. What do you think, what is your opinion as an intellectual, as an intellectual, on French diplomacy and French place in the world? So, just your opinion.
I think in general that France doesn't seem to realize that it is no longer an 18th century world power. And I say this with sad honesty because I have affection for. Oh, the minister left. Oh, okay, good. But I mean, I think that the French. So I'm Anglophone African. I'm not Francophone, but I think that French. The history of French and Francophone relations, I find very vexed and troubling. I think it's interesting, this idea that the CFA, the Francophone currency, is somehow tied to the French franc. I find that really retrograde. I think that the way that there's a kind of cultural power that France wields over Francophone Africa that I think is unhealthy. I think Francophone films are really French films in a way that's not the case in Anglophone West Africa. There is a kind of, I think the way that Anglophone Africans occupy their space in the UK is not the same way that Francophone Africans occupy their space in France. And I think that Francophone Africans who know this, right, and maybe they should be the ones answering this question, because I know I read a bit about it, but I obviously I don't have a personal experience. But I also think that France has France has sort of a star president, the sort of French answer to Barack Obama. Only not as tall, but so maybe that's a good thing for France. I think that there are people who probably wouldn't have cared about France, but because France sort of has this new president who seems interesting and shiny, people are a bit more interested in France. But I should say that my criticism when I started out, and I stand by it, it's because I've had many unpleasant experiences with French immigration. Yesterday was different because they were actually polite, but every time I have come into France, and it's happened, I'm going to say 4 or 5 times in the past 2 years, there is a kind of contempt with which I am dealt with when I present my Nigerian passport that I really find indefensible. And I think it's important because the immigration officers are the first line of contact with the country, and so it shapes the way you think of a country. And I think it takes very little to be polite and to give people their basic dignity. And if I'm coming into a country and I have everything I need and I am legally there, then surely there's no reason to keep me for 30 minutes asking me ridiculous questions, ignoring me for long periods, and just being an ass. So that's what has shaped my irritation with I think it's important to remember that all human beings really deserve equal dignity. It shouldn't depend on the passport that we carry.
Now, for me, I think Madam Chimamanda Ngozi did justice to the questions that the journalist asked, although the journalist looked down on Africa, because one question hit me there. Why would she ask whether there are libraries in Africa or Nigeria, for that matter? This is kind of the thing that Chimamanda has talked about for almost the rest of her life, where there is a sense in which white people think that there are certain things that blacks cannot do. How on earth would this journalist think that in Africa or even in Nigeria, people don't have libraries to read the books that she is publishing? She was thinking that all Chimamanda is doing is just meant to impress the whites and not blacks. I also think this question of language, where French are allowed to speak their language, British are allowed to speak their English language, Spaniards are allowed to speak the Spanish, and then Hungarians are allowed to speak their language, Russians are allowed to speak their language, but then when you come to Africa, our official language are divided depending on the region we come from. You are Anglophone, you are Francophone, so you speak French. You are Anglophone, so you speak English. We as African people must wake up and start being proud of our languages. being proud of our Yoruba language, being proud of our Igbo language, being proud of our Kiswahili. I think in Africa, we must come out and say that enough is enough. We are not going to have Western languages control our daily discourse, because these languages they gave us so that they can understand and easily communicate with us. They can understand what we say in private. Look at our governments. While we struggle to really write books, which is also a challenge for people like Chimamanda and many others, I know scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Chinua Achebe wrote books in their own languages. But it is something that I think we should embrace as a people, as scholars, so that we continue building on our cultural heritage. This is what comes when you know how to tell your story. Chimamanda has represented Africa well in that panel, and I think that is also what led to the exit of the French minister who was present in that interview. It is quite unfortunate that some people think we are not capable of doing certain things, but we will continue proving that Africa is the home of strong and home of the brave. Tell me down in the comment section what you think about this, and if you're watching us for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and also share. Thank you. May the good Lord bless you. Goodbye.